Hey everyone, welcome back to the Coalition for Marriage YouTube channel. This week we've got a very special guest, Lyman Stone, who's going to talk to us about the impending demographic crisis which is taking place all over the world, reduction in birth rates, fewer and fewer kids, more and more older people, and the role that marriage has to play in that conversation. Now, it's a long chat we had with him, so we're going to divide it up into two conversations. This is part one of two, so let's pick it up with Lyman Stone. And Lyman, what a joy it is to talk to you. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, etc., and then we'll get into it.
Sure. I'm a demographer. I work on fertility and population trends and marriage and family formation. I have a couple of hats. I'm a private consultant for companies that make things for babies and moms. And then I also do, policy and public-oriented research to benefit policymakers and anybody working on our public life together. So I kind of have those two elements there.
Great. And I came across you, an article that you wrote a few years ago now, No Ring, No Baby. And your supposition in that article, I think it was about 2018 that was published, was that A, we're facing a demographic crisis, and B, the only solution is marriage. Now, I recently spoke to a guy called Stephen Shaw, who has produced a birth gap video on YouTube, which has had an awful lot of views, and is really highlighting this global, almost, and it is almost, because there are a few people that are bucking the trend, but a global demographic crisis. And so I thought what I'd like to pick your brains on is and I know you've written a follow-up paper on the paper that I saw. I'd like to pick your brains a little bit on, well, is there a demographic crisis? Is marriage really the solution? And if it is, what on earth can we do about it? So start us off if you'd be willing to, please, Lyman. Is there a demographic crisis? What's going on?
Crisis language is always a sticky thing, right? It depends on what you mean by a crisis. Is there a situation with changing, population structure that is going to cause problems and is already causing problems for society? Yes, that's certainly happening. Is it radically different today from what it was a year ago? No. Demography is a discipline where things happen very slowly over time, which means it's sort of either always a crisis or never a crisis. Because once things get moving, it's very hard to stop them. Yeah. And that's the situation that we're in with low fertility. It's not that fertility today is so much lower than it was a year ago or 2 years ago or 3 years ago, although it is a bit lower. But it's that around the world, fertility has been falling persistently for the last 15 to 20 years. Now, a lot of people will be surprised to hear me say that. Say, no, Lyman, fertility's been falling for the last 200 years or 70 years.
And let's put that in so just the numbers so people kind of understand. If you want to replace your society like for like, then you're looking at about between 2.1 and 2.4 children per couple. Is that correct?
It depends. If life expectancy is not improving, if it's just totally stable, and if you have no migration, then in the long run for population stability, you need something like 2.05 to 2.15 children per woman. But if mortality is getting worse, so like if you have a pandemic or if drug and alcohol abuse is worsening or something like that, you might need to have 2.2 or 2.3 kids. And on the other hand, if you have a lot of migration, you might only need to have 1.7, 1.8 kids to grow. Although if you have out-migration, of course, you would need even more. So in general, though, we say 2.1 is what you need to replace. But I don't think that this number is really very important to fixate on. And the reason I say that is, first of all, nothing's ever stable. The world is always changing. But second of all, not all societies want to replace themselves. Some countries, most people in some countries believe that their country is overpopulated and they'd like to shrink. They're entitled to that view. Most people in the world don't believe this, though. In most countries, in most of the world, people want to have more than 2.1 kids. They want to have 2.5 or 3 kids or 3.5 kids. That's the typical thing. So to focus on 2.1 is to flatten a lot of very real variation across human populations, to ignore very real diversity in what people want. And secondly, it's actually to understate the extent of the problem. The problem is not that births are below 2.1, the replacement rate. Okay, whatever. The problem is that births are below 2.5, the level that women in English-speaking countries tend to say that they want. So in New Zealand, Australia, the US, Canada, Ireland, in the UK, women tend to say they want about 2.3 to 2.6 kids. That's what women tend to say that they want. Men as well tend to say that. And so if we're undershooting that, that's the problem, because that means people are not getting the family life that they want. They are not experiencing the kind of human flourishing that they would desire to have, and that in a liberal society we hope they can have.
And then so for Western societies where you've got more people who are getting older, living longer, but they're not having so many kids, maybe 1.5 or below replacement rates, that can result in not enough taxpayers working to pay for the needs and the care of an increasingly elderly population, if you like. And so you have this imbalance potentially in the economy.
Yeah, there's a lot of imbalances it creates. I think most people have heard about, there's not enough taxpayers to pay for old age transfers. It's a very real problem. Yes. What a lot of people don't think about is all the other things, right? So, that's how pensions work, but that's actually how the entire stock market works, right? You buy investments when you're young, and you sell them when you're old, and you hope when you're old they still have value. Why do they still have value? Because the company is selling things to the next generation of young people, right? If there's no next generation of young people for them to sell to, your private investments don't have worth either. But it's actually not just that. If you think about social mobility, how do people move up the ladder in life? A big part of that is because the people on the rungs ahead of them weren't able to hang on, right? And one reason is that rich people tended to have multiple children in the past, and so their inheritances were divided. And so in principle, even if the family fortune kept growing, it might be divided among enough heirs that they kind of gradually sink down the ladder. But if people are only having one child, that doesn't happen anymore. Right? If people are only having one child, then it actually becomes the case that social mobility falls, and basically rich people will successfully perpetuate their wealth even more. Which, of course, for Americans, we don't have an inherited aristocracy, at least in principle. For Europeans, of course, a world where one child inherits the entire family fortune is not unfamiliar. Right? This was much of feudalism. It's not a world most of us want to go back to. So there are a lot of consequences of low fertility. But personally, I think that these kinds of social consequences, they're real, and there's many of them. I mean, if you're South Korea, you're thinking, how will you staff an army to fight off the North Koreans, right? If nobody's being born. There's lots of these consequences. But I have to say, personally, I don't find them very compelling. And the reason I say that is, telling someone you need to have a baby because otherwise, we're going to have techno-feudalism. Or, you need to have a baby or else old people won't get their pension checks. Or you need to have a baby or else who will we conscript to fight in the army? These are not compelling reasons to have a baby.
No, I can say from a personal point of view, from a macroeconomic point of view, you can look at states like China, and some people say, well, they've got 10 years left because they're not replacing their population.
But even from a macro point of view, the macro is simply the sum of the micro.
Yep.
Right? On some level, you have to be able to say, okay, what is the actual reason that an individual suffers from not having children? Because if I tell you the world is going to have, there's not going to be a pension for you in the future. Well, okay, then you better save even more for your retirement, which means don't have a kid. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Rather, the real problem for an individual, if you don't have a child, is you miss out on what having a child would have been to your life.
Yeah.
And the reality is,
right.
people who have fewer children than they say they wanted to have end up less happy with their life. In a society where everybody is less happy with their family is a society that is less functional for everyone.
Yep.
So to me, that's actually the main cost. Yeah, there's these economic costs, but also a lot of those can be offset other ways through taxes and innovation. Okay. Hopefully we can offset the need for conscripts by just not having any more wars, right? That maybe won't
well,
happen.
It's very, very interesting to balance your view there with somebody like Stephen Shaw, who comes at it very much from the economic catastrophe, impending catastrophe. So, and you're looking at it from the personal viewpoint, which is very, very good. So let's assume that actually it's a good thing to replace your population. And not necessarily say, well, as a country, we'll die out, and those who are repopulating around the world, they can come in and replace us. That's okay. So let's assume that actually a country thinks, well, we do want to replace our population. We do want people to have the children they want to have. Because they feel fulfilled in life.
And that's most countries, kind of the countries that are exceptions to that, the countries where people on average say they don't even want to have replacement rate fertility are China, Hong Kong, Malta, and I think there's one or two Eastern European countries where people don't even ideally want to have two kids, that they desire there to be fewer of the people of their country.
Yeah, yeah. So if I can use the word indigenous, I don't know if that's
the native stock.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Indigenous populations
again,
are full.
I'm not going to judge that. Like on some level, like I don't think it's categorically like if you look around at your country and you just say, look, it is too crowded. I think it'd be better off if fewer people lived here. Okay, like it's your choice. It's not my choice.
Yeah, that's a view.
But you can have that view.
Yeah. It's a view. That's right. So you then go on to say, look, okay, we've discussed the ins and outs of the fact that yes, there is globally a demographic change. People are having fewer and fewer children, and there are some areas that are bucking the trend, but generally speaking, people are having fewer children. And if you say, well, this is a problem for either one of a couple of different scenarios, either the macroeconomic scenario or indeed the fact that people aren't being fulfilled. They're not having the kids that they want to have and enjoying the life anyone who's had kids, generally speaking, knows that there's a kind of joy, a kind of richness that nothing else can give you, which you get from the joy of a family, and it's just beyond compare. So assuming that's a good thing, your thesis is the way to address it is through marriage. Now, perhaps we can move on to that and discuss that, because that's absolutely key to what we're about as an organisation, the UK's leading organisation promoting man-woman marriage, i.e., bringing about the best version of the next generation. We're very keen on that as a means of producing the next generation. Your thesis is it's the best way of producing more children. Do you want to take us into why perhaps marriage is more than just a piece of paper, why it should produce any more than cohabiting couples, for example? Why is that the case?
Fertility rates are low in a lot of societies. But you can break that down and you can ask, okay, but is it that, are married couples only having like one child families? Or is it that like nobody's getting married? Right? Now, unmarried people also have children. In most countries, that's a thing. But they don't have children at nearly the same rate. So for example, in the US, the odds of first birth in the U.S., almost half of children are born outside of marriage. So this is a country where non-marital childbirth is very common. Yet even so, rates of first birth are 4 times as high within marriage as outside of marriage. Meaning, for a woman of a given age, she's 4 times as likely, who has not yet had a first birth, she's 4 times as likely to have a first birth if she's married in that year than if she's not. If we look at completed fertility, so like how many children people had when they're older, married women essentially everywhere in the world have more children. In Europe, women who've ever been married average about 1 child more than women who have never been married. And that's true even in places like Sweden or Denmark, where cohabitation is, extremely normal. Even in like South Korea, in South Korea, where, women on average have like 0.7 children, married women on average have like 1.6. Okay. Married people have more kids. They simply do. And the reason is that having children is not a one-off thing, right? It's not like you have a kid and you're done and now you have a kid. You have a child and then you have, 18 to 30 years of work ahead of you, depending on when they leave the nest, right? Which seems to come later and later. And so people tend to embark on that when they feel confident that they have their ducks in a row, that they have an arrangement for long-term management of another person, right? And that means they have income security, maybe a spouse's income to insure against theirs. They have, housing security. Maybe they've been able to buy a house. That means that they have a sense of who's going to help them with the actual work of rearing a child. Marriage tends to be a package that provides a lot of these securities, these sort of insurance products, and so people have more kids when they're married. And what I showed in the article that you referenced, we have this longitudinal survey in the U.S. Where we not only follow women across many decades of their life and look at their marital status and fertility and all these things, but we also, when they were teenagers, we also asked them, how many children do you want to have? Now, of course, those views could change over time. That's fine. People change their mind. But we can just ask very simply, does exposure to marriage change the odds that they hit their desires? And the answer is yes. Women who never married, on average, had 1.5 fewer children than they desired. Women who are married for 1 to 5 years, so who are married for a short period of time, on average had about 0.7 children fewer than they desired. And women who were married 6 or more years, on average, had about 0.4 or 0.5 fewer children than they desired. So even women who had a long-term marriage didn't hit their goals, but their gap was way smaller than women who never married or married only briefly. So getting married at a relatively youthful age, we're not talking about teen marriage here, but mid-20s or something. Yep. Getting married in your mid-20s and staying married tends to be associated with hitting your family goals or getting closer to your family goals, which tends to mean higher fertility. So marriage matters because marriage supplies people real goods and services that are a real benefit to them. And so as a result, it tends to facilitate fertility. And, there's actually a funny twist in this story. If you look at the motherhood wage penalty, okay? There's been research showing that when women have children, they take a big hit to their income. And this has been phrased as a penalty, that women are being penalized for having a baby. And there's truth to that this is a kind of unfair treatment of mothers. But more recent research has shown that actually this penalty is biggest for educated married women. So, less educated unmarried women do not have as big of a motherhood penalty as educated married women. So, is that a penalty Or is it that for those women, it's a choice? For those educated married women, are they being penalized for having a child? Or is it that they actually have the insurance of a committed earning spouse who empowers them to be able to do what they want, which is invest more deeply in that child? Now, in reality, it's a mixture of both, right? It's a choice to stay home, and also a structural discrimination against mothers. It's both and. But I think it's important to recognize that the empirical evidence we have on women's work and family trajectory strongly supports the idea that marriage has a powerful impact, providing a set of basically insurance products.
And then those products, insurance, you're talking about commitments, demonstrable public commitments, which perhaps is not something which is generally associated with cohabitation.
Yes. And I should say, in the Nordic countries, for example, cohabitations tend to be very stable. And actually, there's even a system of legal registration of partnership that's not marriage. And so Nordic cohabitations, because they're very stable and tend to be very public and have a system of legal registration, they do provide a lot of the same benefits of marriage. And so the gap between cohabitant fertility and married fertility is smaller in the Nordic countries than in other countries. It's not nothing, but it is smaller. But the reason for that is because Nordic cohabitations are more stable than American marriages. It's because it's almost marriage by another name. Like, okay, you're not calling it marriage, but like, it's a public legal commitment that ends up with you staying there for decades.
And things like no fault divorce, etc. All those things have an impact on marriage per se, because it reduces that commitment, if you like. Yeah, I get. And the name marriage, of course, different cultures, different languages will call it something different. But you're looking at that long-term commitment, man and woman, forsaking all others, with the view to raising a family, etc. Whatever you may call it, and that publicly attested to, legally binding commitment. Yeah, that's the thing that makes a woman feel okay.
Even on the legally binding part, I think it's important to emphasize what we mean is normatively binding.
Okay.
That is, there are societies that don't have states, right? They don't have laws. So like, what does it mean to be? But they still have marriage, right? Marriage predates a state, so it's normatively binding. It might not. It might be legally enforceable. It might be socially enforceable, but it is enforceable in some way.
Absolutely. Great. So it's quite clear from the data, and we'll point to your article, and in fact the second follow-up thing that you've been working on will point to that too. But it's quite clear for people to go and see that actually marriage makes a difference when it comes to fertility. And by fertility, we don't just mean fertility in the there's a lot of talk these days about sperm counts dropping and blah blah blah. We don't mean fertility, and we mean the actual outcome of the number of children had, whether it's a result of sperm counts or whether it's actually a result of whatever. The end goal is the fertility count, the amount of children that had in the end. Well, look, we'll stop the conversation there, Lyman, and we'll pick it up for our YouTube viewers next week, because I want people to listen to what you've got to say, and so we'll divide it up into two to make that much easier for people. But for now, Lyman, thank you for your time, and we'll speak to you again in a week.